I never thought the smell of salt and old varnish could feel like judgment. Yet there I was, sitting in the witness box of the Lincoln County Courthouse, the same building where my grandfather once argued over docking rights back when the crab fleet still meant something in this town. The air carried that familiar mix of sea rot, floor wax, and the faint bitterness of too many anxious bodies packed into one room. My name is Harper Ellis. I am 27 years old, and 9 seconds ago I was still just the ghost daughter who ran off to Seattle. Now I was something worse. My father's voice filled the small courtroom like a foghorn cutting through morning mist. Robert Ellis had always spoken that way, as if volume alone could make a man right. He stood straight in his faded flannel shirt and worn work boots, the same ones he'd worn the day he told me at 18 that college was a waste if I wasn't coming back to haul pots. Today those boots were planted firm on the wooden floor while he pointed a thick finger toward me. "She hasn't worked an honest day since she left this harbor," he said under oath to the 9 people who had known our family longer than I had been alive. "Walked away from the boats like they were nothing. Now that my father is gone, she wants her cut of what the rest of us bled for. She's been living off whatever scraps she could get, and when that wasn't enough, she started reaching into what didn't belong to her." I did not flinch. I did not look away. Instead, I lifted the plastic cup of water from the rail in front of me. It tasted metallic, lukewarm, the kind that had been sitting in rusted pipes since the courthouse was built sometime in the late 70s. I took one slow sip and set the cup back down without a sound. The jury watched me. So did a handful of locals scattered in the gallery, people who used to wave when I rode my bike down to the docks as a kid. Now their eyes held the same quiet disappointment my father had spent years perfecting. He kept going, waving a folder like it proved every word. His face had gone the deep red of someone who had spent 30 years shouting over engine noise and storm winds. "Ask anyone in this town. Harper Ellis is a stranger here. She says she does consulting work up in Seattle, but there's no office, no real record, nothing solid. She disappeared for months at a time while the fleet was falling apart. While we were losing boats and watching our livelihood sink, she was gone. And now she wants what my father built with his own hands." I sat with my spine straight against the hard wooden chair, feeling every groove in the seat like a reminder of how long this town had held its grudges. Have you ever felt invisible inside your own family? The kind of invisible where they look straight at you but only see the story they decided was true years ago. That hollow ache never really leaves. It just settles deeper the longer you carry it. My younger brother, Caleb, sat in the front row of the gallery wearing the same jacket he'd had since high school. He kept his eyes on the floor, playing the part of the loyal son who stayed behind and did the real work. I knew better. I had seen the messages he sent our father when they thought I wasn't looking, the ones about how much bigger his share would be if I was cut out completely. Inside me, the anger did not burn hot. It felt cold and precise, the same focused calm I used when I was crouched in the dark belly of a listing vessel somewhere off the coast of Washington, listening to voices that were never meant for American ears. I kept my face still while my father dismantled 9 years of my life with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been forced to question his own version of the truth. To him, I was still the girl who chose books and distant cities over the family fleet. To this room, I was the outsider who let the Ellis crab boats nearly die while I chased some fantasy life. They had no idea that the very waters they fished had stayed safe because of choices I made in windowless rooms and on blacked-out decks. They had no idea I had become the shadow that kept their harbor from being swallowed by forces they would never understand. My attorney sat beside me, quiet for now. He knew what was coming. I knew what it would cost. Robert Ellis leaned forward, his voice dropping into that low, certain tone he used when he wanted everyone to feel the weight of his disappointment. "She is a ghost in this family, always has been, and ghosts don't get to claim what the living built." I looked at the back wall of the courtroom where a faded clock ticked past the hour. The second hand moved with the same slow patience I had learned to master. Because in my world, one wrong word, one careless moment could end everything. And today, for the first time in 9 years, that silence I had guarded so carefully was about to crack. The courtroom felt smaller the longer my father spoke, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to hear every accusation. I kept my hands folded in my lap, fingers steady even though the metallic taste of that courthouse water still lingered on my tongue. Robert Ellis wasn't just testifying anymore. He was building a story the entire town could repeat for years, one where I became the villain who walked away from blood and salt water. Caleb stood up when his name was called. My younger brother moved toward the stand with the careful steps of someone who had practiced this moment. He wore the same jacket he always did when the fleet needed repairs, sleeves pushed up to show the scars from hauling lines and crab pots. At 24, he already carried the weathered look of a man who believed he had earned everything the hard way. "She left right after college," Caleb said, his voice cracking just enough to sound genuine. "Told us she had big opportunities in Seattle. We believed her at first. Then the months turned into years. Dad and I were the ones out there when the storms hit in 2023. We lost 2 boats that season, nearly lost the house trying to keep the fleet running. Harper, she sent a text once saying she was between contracts. That was it. No money, no help, nothing." I listened to the way he shaped the silence I had been forced to keep. Each absence they remembered as abandonment. Each time I had gone dark for weeks, sometimes months, on operations that took me hundreds of miles offshore, they had filled the gap with their own bitterness. I remembered the night in October 2 years ago when a foreign vessel had been running dark through our waters, loaded with cargo that would have poisoned the crab grounds for a decade. I had been one of 3 people on a rigid hull inflatable, boarding in heavy seas while the rest of my team coordinated from a mothership that officially did not exist. By the time I made it back to shore, the fleet had been spared another collapse, but I could never tell them why I missed Thanksgiving again. My father nodded from his seat, arms crossed, the same posture he used when he decided a deckhand wasn't pulling his weight. The jury was listening closely now. In this town, honest work meant calloused hands and visible effort. It did not mean spending nights studying intercept patterns or making decisions that kept entire coastlines from being carved up by forces no one here would ever see on the evening news. Caleb kept going, his eyes occasionally flicking toward me with something that looked like hurt, but felt closer to calculation. "After Grandpa got sick, we asked her to come home. She said she couldn't get away. When he passed, the will made it clear. 8 years of active contribution or you step aside. She hasn't contributed anything except excuses. And then we found the withdrawals, money missing from the accounts Grandpa still controlled, signatures that didn't look right. It broke something in me to realize my own sister was taking from us while we were barely keeping the boats afloat. Forgery. The word hung in the air like diesel smoke. They were reaching for it now, turning my necessary distance into theft. I thought of the anonymous transfers I had routed through 3 different channels after the 2023 storms, not because I owed the fleet, but because my mother had loved those boats once, and because the collapse of the local industry would have brought something darker into these waters. I had paid for repairs they would never trace back to me. I had made sure the right people looked the other way when inspections came too close. All of it done from the shadows so the Ellis name could keep its place on the docks. Inside, the anger remained clinical, the same detached focus I relied on when voices crackled over encrypted channels, and one wrong translation could mean lives lost at sea. I remembered the last time I stood in the family house, right after the funeral. The hallway where my college graduation photo used to hang was now bare, except for a cheap print of a lighthouse. My father had conducted his own quiet erasure, the same way he culled weak lines from the fleet. To him, I had become a phase he outgrew the day I chose a different path. The attorney for my father and brother leaned in, voice smooth with practiced concern. "Can you confirm for the court, Caleb, whether Harper ever provided any verifiable support to the family business in the last 8 years?" Caleb shook his head slowly. Nothing we could see. She'd show up for a weekend sometimes, talk about big contracts and important meetings, then disappear again. Meanwhile, Dad and I were the ones mending nets at 2 a.m. She chose the city. She chose to be invisible. Now she wants to be paid for it. I met my brother's eyes for the first time since he took the stand. He looked away first. That small victory tasted bitter, because the truth was heavier than any of them could carry. While they were repairing holes and arguing over bait prices, I had been out there making sure the waters stayed clean enough for crab to thrive. I had intercepted threats that would have turned our harbor into a corridor for something far worse than overfishing. And every time I came home exhausted, carrying bruises I couldn't explain, I had smiled and said I was between cycles. The cost of staying invisible was not just loneliness, it was watching the people you protected rewrite your absence as betrayal. My attorney shifted slightly beside me but stayed silent. He knew the file in his briefcase was still sealed. He knew what it would do when the moment came. For now, the weight of the room pressed down on me alone. The small-town certainty that real daughters stayed. Real daughters showed their hands. Real daughters did not become ghosts. I took another sip of that lukewarm water and felt the rust on my tongue like a reminder. 9 years of silence had kept this town safer than they would ever know, but silence in the Vance Ellis family had never been seen as discipline. It had only ever been seen as guilt. The air in the courtroom had grown thicker, heavy with the scent of salt-soaked wool and the faint undertow of old resentments. Every creak of the wooden benches felt like a verdict already delivered. I sat motionless in the witness box, my posture straight but not rigid, the way I had trained myself to remain during long hours of surveillance when one twitch could betray everything. My father and brother had finished painting their picture, and now the opposing attorney circled closer, his questions sharp as barnacle scrapes. "Miss Ellis," he said, leaning on the rail with the confidence of a man who believed the tide was already turning in his favor, "can you provide this court with any verifiable proof that you have held gainful employment at any point in the last 8 years? A pay stub? A tax return? Anything that isn't just words and excuses?" I looked at him, then past him to where my father sat with his arms crossed, jaw set like the hull of an old trawler. Robert Ellis thought he had me cornered in a world of paper trails and public records, the only kind of proof this town trusted. To him, my life in Seattle was nothing more than a convenient shadow I hid behind while the family bled on the docks. "I work in operations analysis," I answered, my voice level and quiet, carrying just far enough. "My clients require discretion. The records exist, but your inability to access them is not my failure, it is your limitation." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. My father let out a short, mocking laugh that echoed off the paneled walls like a misfired flare. "Discretion? You were chasing contracts that never materialized, Harper. Don't dress up laziness with fancy words. While Caleb and I were out there pulling crab pots in freezing rain, you were playing pretend in some city apartment. You let this family nearly go under." The words landed with the weight of every Sunday dinner I had missed, every holiday where my absence had been noted and cataloged as selfishness. I remembered the winter of 2024, when a sudden shift in currents brought more than just cold water. A network of vessels had been testing the edges of our exclusive economic zone, probing for weaknesses that could have turned our fishing grounds into someone else's corridor. I had spent 18 days on a converted research ship that officially didn't exist, coordinating intercepts that stopped containers from reaching shore, containers that would have introduced toxins capable of wiping out entire seasons of crab. The fleet had survived another year. I had come home with salt still in my hair and bruises hidden under long sleeves, only to hear my father complain that I never helped when it mattered. Caleb shifted in his seat, his face flushed with the righteous anger of someone who believed he had carried the burden alone. She always had an excuse, he added when given the chance, said she was between projects or on the road for meetings, but when Grandpa's medical bills piled up, when the insurance wouldn't cover the new engine we needed after the storm, it was Dad and me working extra shifts. Harper just vanished again. Then, after Grandpa died, we saw the bank statements, withdrawals that didn't match, signatures that looked off. It felt like she was using his confusion to take what she wanted while we were barely holding on. Forgery again? The accusation tasted like rust on metal and seawater. They were reaching deeper now, turning my silence into crime. I had routed those funds carefully, reimbursements disguised as anonymous aid after the fleet's worst season, so the boats could stay operational without raising questions that might expose larger operations. My mother once told me the harbor was more than wood and rope. It was the heartbeat of this town. I had protected that heartbeat from threats no local council meeting would ever discuss. Yet here they stood, using the very gaps I had created to shield them as proof I was hollow. The jury nodded along, faces weathered by years of real, visible labor. In their world, contribution meant hands cracked from lines and decks stained with bait. It did not mean sitting in a darkened wheelhouse hundreds of miles out, listening to encrypted chatter that could shift the balance of entire coastlines. My father had told me when I was 16 that I was a phase, not a future, that a girl's place was beside the family legacy, not chasing distant horizons. He could not imagine a world where I held more authority over these waters than the entire county commission combined. "This isn't about the boats, is it, Dad?" I asked quietly, dropping the formal title. The room stilled. "This is about control. You couldn't control where I went, so now you're rewriting where I've been, telling everyone I'm nothing because you can't see the marks I carry." My father's face deepened to a dangerous shade, the color of storm clouds over the Pacific. "You think you're better than us, hiding up there in Seattle while we fight to keep food on the table? You're not protecting anything. You're just gone." I leaned forward a fraction, my voice cutting through the tension like a cold current. "Careful. When you go looking for the truth in the dark, you might not like what looks back at you." The opposing attorney adjusted his tie, trying to reclaim the rhythm. He turned to the jury with rehearsed sympathy. "Let's look at the facts. No verifiable employer, no digital footprint that matches her claims, just a pattern of disappearances and convenient excuses. The truth is simpler. Harper Ellis is a ghost because she has nothing real to show. She let this family suffer while she lived on the edges." I felt the phantom weight of every sealed mission log, every night I had chosen silence over explanation. The cost of staying invisible was not just the loneliness that settled in my chest like anchor chain. It was watching the people I had shielded rewrite my absence as betrayal, turning my protection into proof of my worthlessness. I had become the silent architect of their fragile stability, the unseen hand keeping the tides from claiming what they loved most. And yet, here they stood, using the very gaps I had created to shield them as proof I was hollow. The jury nodded along, faces weathered by years of real, visible labor. In their world, contribution meant hands cracked from lines and decks stained with bait. It did not mean sitting in a darkened wheelhouse hundreds of miles out, listening to encrypted chatter that could shift the balance of entire coastlines. My father had told me when I was 16 that I was a phase, not a future, that a girl's place was beside the family legacy, not chasing distant horizons. He could not imagine a world where I held more authority over these waters than the entire county commission combined. "This isn't about the boats, is it, Dad?" I asked quietly, dropping the formal title. The room stilled. "This is about control. You couldn't control where I went, so now you're rewriting where I've been, telling everyone I'm nothing because you can't see the marks I carry."
My father's face deepened to a dangerous shade, the color of storm clouds over the Pacific. You think you're better than us, hiding up there in Seattle while we fight to keep food on the table? You're not protecting anything. You're just gone. I leaned forward a fraction, my voice cutting through the tension like a cold current. Careful. When you go looking for the truth in the dark, you might not like what looks back at you. The opposing attorney adjusted his tie, trying to reclaim the rhythm. He turned to the jury with rehearsed sympathy. Let's look at the facts. No verifiable employer, no digital footprint that matches her claims, just a pattern of disappearances and convenient excuses. The truth is simpler. Harper Ellis is a ghost because she has nothing real to show. She let this family suffer while she lived on the edges. I felt the phantom weight of every sealed mission log, every night I had chosen silence over explanation. The cost of staying invisible was not just the loneliness that settled in my chest like anchor chain. It was watching the people I had shielded rewrite my absence as betrayal, turning my protection into proof of my worthlessness. I had become the silent architect of their fragile stability, the unseen hand keeping the tides from claiming what they loved most. And yet, here they stood, using the very gaps I had created to shield them as proof I was hollow. The jury nodded along, faces weathered by years of real, visible labor. In their world, contribution meant hands cracked from lines and decks stained with bait. It did not mean sitting in a darkened wheelhouse hundreds of miles out, listening to encrypted chatter that could shift the balance of entire coastlines. My father had told me when I was 16 that I was a phase, not a future, that a girl's place was beside the family legacy, not chasing distant horizons. He could not imagine a world where I held more authority over these waters than the entire county commission combined. "This isn't about the boats, is it, Dad?" I asked quietly, dropping the formal title. The room stilled. "This is about control. You couldn't control where I went, so now you're rewriting where I've been, telling everyone I'm nothing because you can't see the marks I carry." My father's face deepened to a dangerous shade, the color of storm clouds over the Pacific. The courtroom had gone so still I could hear the distant cry of gulls outside the tall windows. Every eye was fixed on me now, waiting for the crack they believed was coming. My father sat forward in his chair, shoulders tense, the same posture he took when a line snapped and the whole pot threatened to drag the boat under. Caleb watched with narrowed eyes, his hands clenched in his lap like he was already counting the extra share that would soon be his. My attorney finally rose. He did not pace or raise his voice. He simply opened his briefcase with calm precision and removed a single heavy black envelope. The seal on it caught the overhead light, a dull gold emblem that meant nothing to most people in this room, but carried the weight of entire agencies behind it. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and low. The plaintiff's investigation was thorough by civilian standards, but it was searching for a person who, for reasons of national security, is not permitted to exist in public records. Since the accusations have now crossed into claims of fraud, my client has been granted a limited waiver. We would like to introduce a verified statement of service and employment status. He placed the envelope on the judge's bench. The room seemed to lean in. My father's mocking smile faltered for the first time. He stared at the black paper as if it were a foreign buoy drifting into his fishing grounds. The judge broke the seal with deliberate care. He read the document once, then again, his eyebrows drawing together. When he looked up, the tired small-town judge had been replaced by something sharper, the eyes of a man who had once worn a uniform and understood chains of command. "Counsel," the judge said slowly, "you are asserting that this document contains information protected at the highest levels." "I am, Your Honor. The Office of the General Counsel has authorized a limited disclosure to this court only. It confirms the defendant's continuous active service for the past 9 years." My father made a sound low in his throat, halfway between disbelief and anger. This is some kind of stunt. She's been living off nothing but talk. I've seen her apartment. I've seen how she lives. She's nobody. The judge did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Sit down, Mr. Ellis. He turned back to the document, then addressed the entire room. I have before me a verified statement from the Director of National Intelligence. It confirms that Harper Ellis holds a senior operational role within a classified maritime intelligence unit. For the last 9 years, she has served as an undercover operative, focusing on the protection of Pacific shipping lanes and domestic coastal resources. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the gulls outside seemed to pause. The judge continued, his tone carrying new gravity. The vague employment she described, the disappearances, the lack of public records, those were not signs of laziness or fraud. They were operational necessities. The consulting work in Seattle was a cover designation. The blank spaces in her background are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of excellence. He looked directly at my father. Mr. Ellis, you accused your daughter of letting the fleet suffer, of taking money she didn't earn, of being a ghost who contributed nothing. In reality, while you were repairing hulls and arguing over bait prices, she was intercepting threats that could have destroyed the entire local fishing industry, threats that never reached these waters because of the work she did in the shadows. My father's face drained of color. The deep red of certainty faded into something paler, almost gray. Caleb sat frozen, mouth slightly open, the righteous anger draining away like water through a torn net. I felt the shift in the room like a change of tide. The jury no longer looked at me with small-town suspicion. Some faces showed confusion, others dawning respect, a few outright shock. The weight that had pressed on my chest for years began to lift, but not completely. Truth had a cost, too. The judge turned to me. For the first time since the hearing began, someone in this building truly saw me. Not the daughter who left, not the ghost, but the woman who had carried silence as both shield and burden. Miss Ellis, he said quietly, is there anything you wish to add before we proceed? I met my father's eyes across the courtroom. His hands, those thick hands that had once taught me how to tie a bowline knot when I was 8, were now trembling slightly on the rail in front of him. I never wanted this to happen in front of everyone, I said, my voice calm but carrying. I couldn't tell you where I was or what I was doing. That was the job. But every time the fleet faced collapse, every time a storm or outside pressure threatened to cake everything, there were quiet measures taken to keep these waters safe. I did what I could from the places I was allowed to be. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because this harbor still mattered to me, even when I couldn't come home. The opposing attorney stood, but his usual confidence had cracked. He muttered something about needing time to review the document, his voice thin. The judge waved it aside. This court is shifting to a restricted proceeding. Ballast, secure the doors. No one leaves until we address the withdrawal of this complaint. My father tried to speak, but the words came out broken. Harper, we didn't. How were we supposed to know? I stood slowly, smoothing my jacket. The silver pin I wore beneath my collar, a small insignia given only to those who operated in the gray spaces between nations and tides, pressed lightly against my skin. I had kept it hidden for 9 years. Today, it no longer needed to stay secret in this room. You weren't supposed to know the details, I told him, but you were supposed to know me. You were supposed to trust that the girl who grew up on these docks didn't just vanish into nothing, that maybe, just maybe, she was still protecting the only home she ever had. The room felt different now. The salt air coming through the cracked window carried a sharper edge, like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. My brother wouldn't make my eyes. My father looked somehow smaller, the man who had once seemed larger than the ocean itself, now reduced to the weight of his own assumptions. The twist had come, not with thunder, but with the quiet finality of a sealed envelope breaking open. 9 years of invisibility had ended in a single afternoon, and as the judge began issuing sanctions and dismissing the complaint with prejudice, I realized the hardest part was still ahead, because truth doesn't just reveal itself, it demands you decide what to do with what remains.
The heavy oak doors of the courthouse closed behind me with a solid, final sound that echoed down the marble hallway. Outside, the coastal air hit me clean and sharp, carrying the familiar brine of the Pacific and the faint cry of gulls circling over the harbor. I stood for a moment on the wide stone steps, letting the wind tug at my jacket, feeling the weight of 9 years begin to settle into something lighter. My father followed a few minutes later, moving slower than I had ever seen him. Robert Ellis looked older in the daylight, the lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders no longer squared like the captain of a fleet. Caleb trailed behind him, hands shoved deep into his pockets, eyes fixed on the cracked pavement. Neither of them spoke at first. The sanctions had been issued: legal fees, damages, a public dismissal with prejudice. The boats would stay in the family, but the victory tasted like seawater in an open wound. I turned to face them. The silver insignia pin was still clipped beneath my collar, no longer hidden. For the first time in nearly a decade, I didn't feel the need to shrink myself to fit their story. "You weren't supposed to know the details," I said quietly, repeating the words from the courtroom, but softer now, without the audience. "That was the job. But you were supposed to know me, Dad. You were supposed to trust that the daughter who grew up hauling lines beside you didn't just disappear because she stopped caring." My father stopped a few feet away, his thick hands, the same ones that had taught me to tie knots and read the weather, hung loose at his sides. We really thought you had walked away from everything, that you were living easy while we fought to keep the fleet alive. The withdrawals, the long absences, it looked like theft. It looked like you didn't care." "It looked that way because I couldn't let it look any other way," I answered. "There were vessels out there that would have poisoned these waters for years, networks that would have turned our harbor into a route for things worse than overfishing. I stopped some of them. I made sure the crab grounds stayed clean enough for another season. The money that reached the accounts after the big storm, that was me too. Not because I owed the boats, but because this place still mattered, even when I couldn't come home." Caleb lifted his head finally. His voice came out rough. "Why didn't you just say something? Anything?" "Because saying anything could have cost lives. Mine, yours, the whole town's if the wrong people noticed. My job was to stay invisible so you could keep fishing without knowing how close the edge was." I looked out toward the harbor, where the masts of the remaining Ellis boats rocked gently against the docks. I never wanted the fleet. I just didn't want to watch it die because I wasn't allowed to explain why I was gone. The wind picked up, carrying the sharp scent of kelp and diesel from the working piers. My father stared at the water for a long time, the same water he had cursed me for leaving. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "I called you a ghost. I told everyone you were nothing. And all that time, you were out there protecting it, protecting us." I nodded once. "I was the shadow you never saw. The cost of that shadow was letting you believe the worst of me. I accepted it because the alternative was worse. But today, that silence ended." We stood there together on the courthouse steps, 3 people bound by blood and salt, finally seeing one another without the fog of old stories between us. There was no grand embrace, no sudden tears, just the slow, heavy recognition that years had been lost to assumptions and necessary lies. The validation gap I had carried for so long didn't vanish, but it felt smaller now, like a tide that had finally turned. "I'm not asking you to understand everything. Some parts I still can't share, but the boats are safe for now. The harbor is still ours. That's enough." My father reached out, his calloused hand resting briefly on my shoulder, the first real touch in years that wasn't weighted with disappointment. "Come by the house sometime, Harper, not as a ghost, as you are." Caleb gave a small, awkward nod. "Yeah, we could use the help, real help, if you're allowed." I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both relief and the knowledge that some distances would take time to close. "I'll come when I can, and when I can't, you'll know it's for the same reason it always was." I turned and walked down the steps toward the parking lot. Behind me, the courthouse stood solid against the coastal sky, its old walls holding the echoes of accusations and revelations. In the distance, the harbor waited, masts swaying, water glinkling under the late afternoon sun. For 9 years, I had moved through the world as someone who could not be seen. Today, in this small corner of it, I had finally been witnessed. As I reached my car and slid into the driver's seat, I unclipped the silver insignia pin and placed it carefully in its small velvet box. The next chapter of my life wouldn't be written entirely in shadows anymore. Some parts would still belong to the gray spaces between tides and nations, but others, the ones that mattered most to the girl who once learned to read the currents from her father's side, could now belong to the light as well. I started the engine and pulled away, heading toward the harbor road. The wind through the open window tasted clean. For the first time in years, I wasn't running from their story. I was finally writing my own.